Welcome to part 4 of 5 Smooth Stones for Spiritual Formation. Again, our goal in this series is to lay out a set of foundational axioms that help to capture the nature and process of discipleship, the shaping of our characters, our attitudes and tastes, the formation of our identities. So we're not so much focusing on particular practices, although we do mention some along the way. Instead, we're trying to give a set of principles that you can take with you into everything you do, into your preaching, your teaching, the small group experiences you're part of, the ways that you nurture spiritual formation in your own life and in the lives of other people, even how we practice evangelism. So far, we've emphasized that the outcome of spiritual formation is something more than just a set of propositions we hold in our heads. We want the gospel to reach down to the level of our gut reactions to the world, to our largely inarticulate and intuitive sense of who we are and how things work. In parts 2 and 3, we emphasize the role in formation of our physicality, our sensory experiences, and also our rootedness in community. Spiritual formation is embodied and socially embedded. It's the result of what we do with our bodies, what happens to our bodies. And so the challenge is to think of spirituality holistically in a way that is multisensory. And of course, when you look at Scripture, you see this over and over again. They stand, they kneel, they raise their hands, they lay on hands, they lift their eyes, they eat and drink, they smell, they touch, they hear, they sing and speak. It's the whole body. But as we've emphasized, it's also the body in community. We're formed through processes of attachment, imitation, empathy, shared liturgies, shared spaces and activities, and ultimately by participating together in a shared story. Well, those two elements bring us to our focus today, and that is to the central role of practice, of embodied communal practice in spiritual formation. The persons we become are the result of the habitual practices that we engage in together. To introduce this, I'll tell you about an experience I had when I first started teaching down in Washington, D.C. at the George Washington University. Here's what happened. I had been hired as an adjunct professor to teach a course in research methods at 2 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Since I lived pretty far out in Maryland, I would have to drive down to a subway station, park my car, get on the subway, and ride into campus, teach my class, and then reverse the process. That meant that I was getting back in my car for the final leg of my journey at about 4:15 or so. On top of that, I was so nervous about teaching that I really just couldn't eat before class. So by the time I got in the car, I was hungry, on top of being a little strung out from the whole process and feeling a little bit self-indulgent. Well, just up the road from the metro station was a McDonald's, which was offering a special deal. 2 double cheeseburgers for $3. So that first Tuesday, I was feeling all those sensations. I saw the advertisement on the marquee, and I pulled into the drive-thru. Oh, those cheeseburgers were heavenly. Salt, fat, carbs. What a rush. Well, guess what? The next week, I got in my car after teaching, and I was feeling the same kind of sensations, started driving up and saw the McDonald's and felt that sense of craving, and you guessed it, I pulled in and got 2 double cheeseburgers. By the third week, I was feeling the craving before I even got into my car. I had unwittingly engaged in a repeated practice, and in that short amount of time, it had formed a habit. And that's how we are formed. By our repeated practices that come to control our whole approach to the world. Christian philosopher James K. Smith, whom we've mentioned in earlier talks, emphasizes this process happening at a cultural level. He says that we humans are lovers in the sense that we all orient our lives towards some vision of the good life. All of us have a bullseye out there that we're aiming for. It's not so much a conscious intention. It's more of a gut sense. We just know it's in our bones. The problem is that we don't come hardwired with what that vision will be. It's more that we're socialized into that vision through repeated engagement in cultural practices. In our early years, we watch and we imitate and we catch a vision of the good life. Smith emphasizes the kinds of cultural practices that orient us to the good life. Going to a high school football game, entering a shopping mall, going through new student orientation at college, and so forth. You can imagine all these things that we do over and over again that orient us to a vision of the good life. In our last session, I talked about how my study abroad students, when they were planning worship, wanted to turn the lights down so that they could retreat into their private worship cocoons, and how I challenged them to think about the vision of discipleship that creates for us. How it socializes us into a very personal, private, individualistic encounter with God that doesn't require you to be vulnerable to anyone else. Doesn't require you to be patient with anyone else, that you work with anyone else, that you find support from anyone else. It's just you and God. Again, the habitual practice forms the imagination, the gut-level sense of the world. As Smith puts it, these holistic embodied social practices and rituals train the heart, as it were, to desire certain ends. Over time, he continues, rituals and practices, often in tandem with aesthetic phenomena like pictures and stories, mold and shape our precognitive disposition to the world by training our desires. Again, at the heart of our formation lies this reality. We are formed by the practices that we repeat personally and collectively. Those form habits, and those habits become who we are. In fact, let me emphasize that point again. In a way, you, that is, the person you are, is really a function of the habits you have formed. Habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of acting, habits of seeing the world. You are the accumulation of the habits you have formed. And habits are the product of repeated conscious and unconscious practice. And that's why they're so important. Now, I want to go just a little deeper to explore how those habits are formed. For this, I'll draw on the fascinating work by a journalist named Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit. What Duhigg did was to pull together some of the latest neuropsychological research into habit formation in the brain, and to make that research available and practical to the public. I highly recommend his book. He begins by telling the story of a lab monkey named Julio. Julio loved blackberry juice. And so the researchers put Julio in a training situation where his brain was being monitored. He'd be looking at a screen and would see different shapes and colors appear on the screen, and eventually he was trained to press a lever when he saw a blue line, and then he'd get a reward, a shot of blackberry juice. At first, they noticed that his brain would light up when he got the shot of blackberry juice. The neurological activity in his brain said, in essence, "Hey, I got a reward." But here's what the researchers found. Pretty soon, he would begin to anticipate the blackberry juice before it came. His brain would light up with the "I got a reward" activity as soon as he saw the shapes on the screen. In other words, his brain was registering a reward before he actually got the reward. As you might guess, when he didn't get the reward, he would become angry, mopey, and would make unhappy noises. What all this points to is the creation of a craving in the brain. From this, the researchers posited a basic model of habit formation that they call the habit loop. Imagine a circle. On one side is the cue that evokes the anticipation of the reward. On the other side is the reward itself. So for Julio, the cue was the shapes on the screen, and the reward was that shot of blackberry juice. Of course, the path from the cue to the reward is the routine that you perform in order to get the reward. And when that happens, you begin to anticipate the reward, which creates a craving. And that's the thing that drives the whole experience, is craving. Duhigg writes, this explains why habits are so powerful. They create neurological cravings. Most of the time, these cravings emerge gradually, so gradually that we're not even aware that they exist. so we're often blind to their influence. But as we associate cues with certain rewards, a subconscious craving emerges in our brains that starts the habit loop spinning. So think about what happens when someone brings one of those boxes to your office with orange on one flap and pink on the other, and those big letters that say Dunkin'. As Duhigg said, there's nothing programmed into our brains that makes us see a box of donuts and automatically want a sugary treat. But once our brains learn that a donut box contains yummy sugar and other carbohydrates, it will start anticipating the sugar high. Our brains will push us toward that box. And if we don't eat the donut, we'll feel disappointed. That's how new habits form, putting together a cue, a routine, and a reward, and then practicing it so that it becomes second nature. Think about how email or social media harness this process. You're working on some project and suddenly your computer or your device emits that little sound. Immediately your brain starts anticipating a momentary distraction. You feel what many have described as a rush of adrenaline at what opening that email or text or social media app might hold for you. Watch what happens in a meeting when people haven't turned their cell phones off. Duhigg writes, that expectation, if unsatisfied, can build until a meeting is filled with antsy executives checking their buzzing smartphones under the table, even if they know it's probably only their latest fantasy football results. Now, here's the question. If this is how God has wired us up, to form habits that way, how might we harness that process to build a habit, say, of daily exercise? Well, it's pretty simple. You need a cue and a reward. The routine, of course, will be the exercise practice itself. For the reward, it's probably not going to be the runner's high, at least at first. Instead, aim for something a little more accessible. It might be just the satisfaction that comes from knowing you're doing something to help your body and your mind to function better. Or it might be the reward of a big breakfast when you're done. The cue might be setting your exercise clothes out the night before. How about the habit of daily prayer? Again, it's pretty simple. You need a cue and a reward. The cue might be setting out your coffee cup the night before, and the reward might simply be the satisfaction that you've done something you know you need to do. Of course, the routine would be the practice of prayer that you've decided on. For me, I use the Lord's Prayer as an outline for my daily prayer life. Over time, that initial reward would give way to a richer reward, a sense of the presence of God, or at least a sense of peace and strength. Others have talked about setting a reminder on their phone, especially if you want to set aside times during the day when you can stop and pray. Or for you non-techies, it can be as simple as putting up blank post-it notes at various places in your world, in your home, in your car, in your place of work. And every time you see one of those, it becomes a reminder to pray. I do a meditation practice every morning. And at first, the reward was just checking to see how many days in a row I'd done it. But over time, the reward simply became the sense of peace and groundedness that it brings to me. One other thing that people who study habits have found, if you can join your practice to a habit you've already formed, then it will be much easier to sustain. I mentioned my coffee cup. I begin my day by making coffee in my French press every morning, same routine, pretty much the same time. And so connecting that practice of daily Bible reading to my coffee wasn't all that hard because I added it to something I was already doing. Over time, that gave me a routine to which I could add the practice of daily meditation. I also take a walk every morning. I've been doing it for more than 40 years now. I do it wherever I am. I might be in a hotel or staying at someone else's house, staying somewhere across the globe. I still do that daily walk. And that morning walk is always my prayer time. But at this point, I've been doing it for so long that I don't even think about it. I just get on my shoes and step out of the door, and without thinking or intending, I just find myself praying. It's become second nature. And that's the beauty of practices that lead to habits. They form us. That's why in the early centuries of Christianity, new converts were drawn into ways of practicing faith that sometimes took several years. In his research into early Christian catechesis or instruction, church historian Alan Kreider talked about how people coming to faith were seen as apprentices and how they underwent a period of practical training in how to live as Christians. They each had a sponsor who worked with them, and they were engaged in doing the things that Christians do: caring for the poor, visiting widows, performing other good works in the community, even as they began to learn the Bible stories that would form the content of their faith. Only when their sponsors could vouch for them that they were truly living as Christians would they then memorize the creeds, that's the immersion in Christian doctrine, and then they would be baptized. And only then would they be allowed to attend worship. I'm struck by how dramatically different we've sometimes approached evangelism and discipleship. We have focused on getting some content into people's heads, getting them to give their assent to a set of propositions. And then we've struggled with how to get them to behave, to live like the Christians are supposed to live. Maybe those early Christians knew something we need to relearn, that we are formed by our practices, that for the gospel to get into our bones, for it to become our social imaginary, it needs to take root in a set of Christian practices. And so, as we consider how to nurture spiritual formation in ourselves and in those we care for, this is our challenge. Think practice. Whatever we teach, we need to find ways for people to practice it. We need to give them strategies for building those practices into their daily lives and into the life of the community. In fact, I would encourage us to begin using the vocabulary of practice. This is my practice. This is our practice. To let that become our fundamental lens for how we see the whole enterprise of discipleship. Let me close with one final example, my absolute favorite. It comes from C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, letter 17. He writes about prayer as adoration, what it means to glorify God. When the letter opens, he's recalling how he and his imaginary interlocutor, Malcolm, were once walking in the woods talking about prayer, and how Lewis thought that in order to adore or glorify God, he needed to think about some abstract theological formula or concept like the goodness and greatness of God, the means of grace and the hope of glory. It's like he's trying to think about these ideas, get those ideas in his head, and then summon some spiritual fervor in response to them so that he can give God glory. The problem is that the dial's not moving. Those mere ideas just didn't evoke any fervor within him. And here's how Malcolm responds. It's a hot day. They've been walking for a while. They've stopped beside a little brook. It's a beautiful place. You can imagine the sun dappled on the surface of the water as it ripples over rocks, and feel the soft, cushiony moss on the bank, and see the many different shades of green in the leaves and moss and grass. Malcolm reaches down and gets some cold water from that little brook and splashes his burning face, and then he says, "Why not begin with this?" In other words, why not be fully present to this little experience of pleasure and then turn to God in the prayer that says, "God, how wonderful you are to have created this, to have given me the capacity to enjoy this." And Lewis says, and it worked. He came to realize that pleasures are shafts of the glory of God as it strikes our sensibilities. When we taste pleasure and beauty, we are being touched by a finger of the God at whose right hand are pleasures forevermore. This was the practice he was inviting us to engage in. Be attentive to the pleasures that come to us through sight and smell and taste and hearing and touch. Savor them. And don't just say thank you for this, as important as that is. Beyond that, instead, lift up your eyes to God in the prayer that says, "What must you be like to have created this. It's that simple. This two-step practice. Savor the pleasure and then glorify God. And that's how we learn to adore God, how we glorify God. In the tradition of the psalmist who steps out on his threshold, sees the rising sun and exclaims, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament displays the work of your hands, God." But here's where it even gets better. Later in that same letter, Lewis talks about what it's like to hear a bird. We hear this sound and we say, that's a bird. But in truth, it's actually more complex than that. What's really happening is that we're hearing a sound and we go through the files in our brain to find of all the possible matches that sound might signify. It's not the refrigerator, it's not a city bus, it's not a dog barking, it's a bird. It's just that we've had so much practice. Same with reading words on a page. We're actually seeing black marks against a white field. And we're making sense of them through a pretty complex process of decoding. It's just that we've had so much practice that it happens almost instantaneously. In fact, once you've learned to read, it's hard to go back to seeing just black marks on a white field. You almost have to cross your eyes a bit and blur the page. It's become that instinctive. Here's what Lewis was suggesting. If we practice diligently enough, we could actually get to the point where every experience of pleasure and beauty would be an instant theophany. We wouldn't have to notice it and then say the prayer. It would happen instantly, almost spontaneously. Every pleasure would bring with it the sensation, this also is thou. What a possibility to have engaged in that practice of noticing and then offering praise to God to the point where our days would be filled with tangible, visceral pointers to the presence and goodness of the Lord. But we won't get there just by thinking about it. We will only get there. We will only begin to get there if we join together in a community of practice. Thanks for listening.